Good morning. My name is John Duffy, and I'm on the Board of Trustees. Welcome to the North Shore Unitarian Church, where our mission is to empower people to live with greater depth, meaning, and purpose. One of the things I love about this place is it gives me an opportunity to invest myself in a long-term communal effort. And it's a communal effort that I have a strong sense of ownership in. This isn't just any church. This is my church. This isn't any community. This is my community. And I really enjoy devoting myself here. In this community, we celebrate people from all walks of life. No matter how you make your living or how you experience the sacred, no matter who you are or who you love, we hope you will feel welcome here.
And good morning again, everyone. It is so nice to see so many bright faces here on such a gray morning. My name is Ariel, and I'm the Youth Program and Connections Coordinator, and I'd like to give an extra special welcome to any visitors we might have here this morning. If you would like to get to know more about our community, I would invite you to sign in on the iPad that's in the foyer or fill out a visitor's information card that's found in the front of your chair or front of your pew. There are friendly volunteers wearing greeter buttons who'd be really happy to answer any questions you might have about this community or this living tradition we share. And after the service, I'd invite newcomers and anyone else to come downstairs for tea or coffee and conversation. And today there are also gourmet sandwiches that you can buy for lunch. So I have some announcements. One announcement really, which is a really big thank you to the Buildings and Grounds team and all of the volunteers who came out on, I believe it was Saturday, to do a big fall cleanup. Thank you so much for all of your service. So welcome, everyone.
One of the things I appreciate the most about being a lay chaplain of North Shore Unitarian and presiding over memorial services are the stories that get shared in the private meeting with the family and at the memorial service. I always feel honored to be let into the lives of strangers in this most intimate way. It's not just the stories about the person, the deceased, that grab and inspire me. It's that I get to watch this process unfold before me with the living. In the pre-meeting with the family to discuss the service, I sit and I watch and I listen as the family members meet themselves in a new way. They meet their grief or anger or stoicism. I watch them meet their best and worst, funny and tragic memories. And I watch them come to this place where they need to reconcile the fact that a very important storyline has ended. I recall working with one family on the memorial service of the wife and mother, and I got to hear all about her dedication to her family and her community, and her determination to never let her chronic health condition stop her from engaging fully in life. Her daughter recounted to me the story of her mom, who couldn't really run or do much physical activity because of her condition, but who found her freedom and speed in the form of a car. She recounted to me how her mom would get in the car, pull down the convertible top, and zip around the city, and got really good at talking her way out of speeding tickets. Laughter filled the room among the tears shed, and we had this moment of shared, rich connection. And that is why we come to church. Because scattered among our lives, we have storylines beginning and ending all the time. And it matters that we have a community of listeners and witnesses and mentors and catalysts to share them with.
And I have a story to tell. So if any young folks, any children, anybody who would like to come up front for a story, come on up. And as you do, I want to offer a special thank you from the Artarians. You know, there's a group of artists in the congregation who call themselves Artarian. Get it? Unitarian, but with art. Artarian. That's kind of clever, no? No? There's Artarians, and they arrange for our sanctuary to be decorated each month. And I know that some of the kids here, maybe some of the youth who are not here, offered many of the pieces that are in the sanctuary, especially these ones on the end here you can see. So thanks so much for participating. And I have a question for you to begin today. If you could have a superpower, have you ever been asked this before? If you could have any superpower, what would it be? Oh, yeah, hold on to your chalice. What would it be? Yeah. If you touch somebody, you would have their superpower. Would they still have it too, or would you take it from them? Oh, you'd take it from them. This is almost exactly the opposite of what my story is about today. Yes.
I would probably have either shape-shifting or super speed.
Shape-shifting or super speed. Oh yeah, tough decision. Very different, interesting. And anybody else, superpowers? Yeah? Super speed and invisibility, superpowers. So I think that's an interesting question to ask. What superpower would you like to have? But you've seen, regardless of if you have one in mind or not, you've seen superheroes, right? Like not in real life, but you know what a superhero. Can you just show me some like superhero poses? What does a superhero do? Oh, yeah, Emily's got a good one. So we've got super poses of superheroes who can fly, superheroes who are super strong. What would a superhero who was super loving look like? What would the pose be? Any ideas? And so the story I want to tell you, it's a really short story, but the story I want to tell you is about a superhero whose power was to give other people superpowers. What would that superpower look like? If you were going to do the pose for that superhero, what would it be?
The opposite of me.
What would it be? Oh, be like that? Oh, that's nice, yeah. Just a little tap on the shoulder. So, this superhero, what she would do is she would go somewhere where there was some trouble going on. But instead of going in and fixing it all herself, she would go in and she would put her hands right up on the cheeks of one of the people who was already there. And she would look deep into their eyes. She'd look so deep into their eyes that she'd see right into their heart. And she'd see the superpower that was already there. And by saying it aloud, the person who she was holding would suddenly feel it bubbling up through their heart and out into their skin, and they would have that superpower. And so I wonder, if she came up to you, and she put her hands right up on your cheeks, and she looked into your eyes all the way down into your heart, and she said the superpower that was already inside you, what would that be? It's a little bit of a different question than the superpower you wish you would have. What's the superpower that's already inside you? Instead of answering, think about it for a little while and then tell me later, okay? Would you rise in body or spirit, and we'll sing our children to their classes.
This is the final Sunday of the Canvas, and I assume most of you have already returned your pledges. So this morning I am speaking specifically to my fellow procrastinators. The rest of you are, of course, welcome to listen, but I don't really care whether you like what I have to say, because we've already gotten your pledge and there are no takesy-backsies. I moved to Vancouver in August of 2011 to pursue stand-up comedy and also the woman that I would eventually marry. When I first moved here, I didn't know anyone. I went to stand-up shows, I played hockey, and I joined another church that I won't name. But none of those activities filled the social void the way they had in Victoria, because everywhere I went, I was always surrounded by strangers. Even in the choir, the only people who talked to me were in my own section. Everywhere I went, I felt isolated, whether or not I was actually alone. When I went back to Victoria for Christmas that year, I was reminded what church is supposed to be like. It shouldn't feel like a chore. It should energize rather than drain you. Christina Stevens had been bugging me to come and try this church since before I moved. And so the first Sunday in January, I made it over here. And I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to say that more people talked to me after church that first Sunday than in the entire 4 months at the other church. Thursday choir practices immediately became the highlight of my week. Whether I was doing a horrible stand-up show or couldn't even get booked on one at all, there was at least one thing I had to look forward to, one thing to lift my spirits. This place was the non-certified treatment for my undiagnosed depression. The things I do for this church and the money I contribute are not a gift. They are on the beneficiary side of a very unequal trade. A community which you can literally walk into one Sunday morning and immediately be made to feel welcome is an extraordinarily rare thing. And whatever I do to support this community is only a tiny fraction of the support that I have received. But all those tiny fractions are what make up the whole. And I think even the staunchest atheist would have to agree that there's something about that that's maybe almost kind of a miracle. My only regret is that I didn't come here sooner, but sometimes even if you know what you should be doing, it takes a little extra nudge to get around to it. If you haven't returned your pledge yet, this is the morning to get around to it. Thank you.
And you, what superpower would you have? And you, what superpower already lies within? Preparing for this service, the question that I began to ask is, what's the difference? Is there really a fundamental difference between that question that, if it's been a while since you were a kid, is kind of a common question in camps and schools? What would your superpower be? Is there a fundamental difference between that question and a question of ancient times, what God do you worship? Or who is your patron saint? And there's important differences, of course, but there's a shared root here. There's this shared root of the need to make sense of our lives in the context of stories way bigger than our own. To give personification, faces, and story to the archetypal forces of the world. Emily started asking me, so if you want the superpower to fly, do you worship the God of freedom? And if you want that superpower to read someone else's mind, is it the God of connection, of intimacy you worship? That's just a seed of a question that started off. And so this idea of archetypal forces, personifying archetypal forces, it's what Shane Cookson, the slam poet, local here in Vancouver, I'm sure some of you are familiar with his work. He asks that question in a piece called Shoulders. And we're going to do a little experiment. I'm going to show a piece of that poem that's set to animation and music by his creative team. And so it's about 3 minutes long. So it's a reading, but directly from Shane in video form today. And I'll warn you briefly, there's a word in it that you don't usually hear in church. It starts with the letter F. And so I hope that it doesn't land too harshly on any ears. It's a humorous moment in the video. Shane's done a number of these pieces, taking his poetry and turning it into multimedia magic. . 'Cause 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 ' So mythology was our first attempt to understand the world in which we live. We put a god in everything. According to scholars of Western philosophy, one of the great changes in culture, at least in the expansive region of the world that for many centuries was shaped by power centers around the Mediterranean Sea, one of the great changes in Western culture occurred over a few hundred years, starting around 500 or 600 BCE. And the shift, it involved scholars like Thales of Miletus and Parmenides and Heraclitus and Plato and Socrates and Pythagoras and Aristotle. You've heard of some of these guys. And as philosophical thought evolved from generation to generation, it shifted from a mythocentric worldview to a logocentric worldview. Right, from mythos, from story to logos to logic and word. And stories about the pantheon of the Greek gods were replaced very gradually with attempts at naturalistic explanation of how the world works. Mythos was supplanted by logos. And while it was a very slow shift, you can see it change in these writers, these storytellers. All those folks I just mentioned, some of whom are of course revered as originators of scientific understanding, they made references in their work to the gods to explain various concepts. Even someone like Aristotle, as he explicitly rejected a literal understanding of the Greek pantheon, he assigned personality and human characteristics like the ability to contemplate to the natural forces of the universe, cataloged in his Metaphysics. And there's a view of history, and it's part of our culture, our modern culture, our Unitarian culture in particular. It's a part of us. This view of history that looks at human development and says the shift from mythos to logos is the great accomplishment of humanity. This view, it traces the history from those old Greek dudes to then some Renaissance dudes a little while later, and then some Enlightenment dudes after that, and finally into the modern and postmodern age with maybe a little more wiggle room for gender amongst the scientists and thinkers at the contemporary tip of the logos-shaped arrow. In this view, it shows up in our Unitarian history when Thomas Jefferson made his own version of the Bible. Some of you know this story. He clipped out everywhere in the Bible where there was a miracle or anything else that defied kind of scientific logical explanation. So he just cut and paste, and then he had the Jefferson Bible. Or James Freeman Clarke, he's a 19th century contemporary of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who in his 5 points of the New Theology, one of our Unitarian forebears, declares belief in the progress of mankind onward and upward forever. This is deep in us. It's in our cultural DNA. And it has its beauty, this logocentric view. Certainly, enormous suffering has been alleviated through what has been made possible by that change in worldview, by logical reasoning, scientific methodology. But I do think that, like any worldview, there's a danger in a fundamentalist approach to logos thinking. Like literal belief in the Bible to the expense of rational thinking is dangerous, also rationalism that denies any role for mythological thinking has failed to take seriously the role of story in the construction of our identities and how we understand the world. Theism that places all agency in a deity's hands denies the possibility of cultural change and progress is dangerous, but also atheism that denies any role for stories or images or questions about God or gods has failed to take seriously the need for metaphor in addressing ultimate questions about the nature of reality. We know all too well the dangers of a fundamentalist approach to sacred texts and sacred religious traditions. And to be clear, I'm not trying to make an equivalency here, but there is also a danger in a fundamentalist devotion to logos. The truth is, many scholars of religion claim that in mythocentric cultures, the stories of gods and goddesses were assumed to be metaphorical, not literal. In her book, The History of God, scholar Karen Armstrong, she argues that ancient myths were never meant to be taken literally, but were, quote, metaphorical attempts to describe a reality that was too complex and elusive to express in any other way. These dramatic and evocative stories of gods and goddesses helped people to articulate their sense of the powerful but unseen forces that surrounded them, she says. As Shane put it, those gods were just stories, but stories became a large part of how we learn. They burn lessons into our memories. They become a part of how we remember. And I know I've maybe tread on a little bit close to dangerous territory for some of you at this point. So I want to go back to my first question about superheroes. That feels a little safer now. Because I'm not suggesting, actually, that all of us should be thinking about gods more, per se. Gods, they're just one way of telling these stories. Starting around the year 400, the Christian church, it spent centuries working hard to stomp out the old gods. Not just the Greek and Roman pantheons, but eventually the Norse and Celt, all the indigenous pantheons of that continent, and eventually then of other continents. But no sooner were they struck down than they reemerged, often in the form of saints. The Catholic saints, like the old gods, ended up with their fields of jurisdiction. Pray to St. Anthony for lost things, St. Jude for lost causes. All around the world, whenever monotheism has been enforced, indigenous pantheons were mapped onto saints and stories, surviving covertly. The scholars call this syncretic religion. And then, fast forwarding to modern secular culture, when all talk of gods was quaint, and Nietzsche had declared God is dead, and paying homage to the saints was a curious practice of those Catholics. And here we are in the 1930s now, as humanism emerged as a modern religious, intellectual, social movement, began to play a dominant role in the culture, and right alongside, right at the same time, the rise of superheroes. Many based explicitly on the old gods, all telling archetypal stories about human nature and the nature of the world. Superheroes arose in secular society to fill this need, to tell stories that make the largest forces comprehensible in a human scale. So I want to share a story from a Jesuit priest, contemporary Jesuit priest. His name is Paul Lichtig. He says, once upon a time, I was Superman. I was 4 years old and needed only a safety pin and a ratty piece of red cloth to transform from a mild-mannered toddler into a boy of steel. I still remember my friend Ming and myself running through his house with towels fastened around our necks. I was Superman, but Ming was a genius. Ming's white terry cloth towel cape was fastened in place by a smiling blue whale pin. While I could fly, shoot heat beams out of my eyes, and blow frost, Cetacean Man Ming had the powers of both Leviathan and Juggernaut. He was a master of the ocean with the strength to upend aircraft carriers while rampaging through the living room, shooting water streams at typhoon-like velocity from his mouth, much to the dismay of his arch-nemesis, Mom. That was Ming. Imaginative and mischievous, capable of turning the most mundane of circumstances into a havoc-wreaking experience of a lifetime. In our imaginations, we could try on various roles and characters and would think of new ways to use our surroundings and explore the boundaries of right and wrong. We drove his mom crazy, and we would get punished. But we loved it because we both were and were not the characters that we represented, and we could do anything. For me, it was Captain Planet. Do you know Captain Planet? Captain Planet, he's our hero. Gonna take pollution down to zero. It was late 80s, early 90s. It wasn't just Captain Planet himself, though. See, the mythology was that there were 5 young people, the Planeteers. And each had a ring representing an element. There was Kwame from Ghana, who was the leader of the group, had the power of earth. And Wheeler from the United States, who was hot-headed and wielded the power of fire. And Linka from the Soviet Union, who excelled in strategy and logic and had the power of wind. G from East Asia, who was a marine biologist and had the power of water. And finally, Mati, the youngest from the Amazon, whose super ability was empathy from the element heart. That might not surprise you, he was my favorite. And this international team of teenagers would work together solving problems to protect the earth until there came that moment in each episode when their individual powers were no longer enough and they would bring their rings together and declare, "By our powers combined, Captain Planet." He would appear and save the day. It was an ingenious mythology for raising a generation of environmentalists. In fact, I'm certain that Captain Planet, the Planeteers, their supernatural powers and mythological stories did more to shape my relationship to the earth and environmentalism than any logos I later learned about pollution, climate change, and sustainability. Not that that learning wasn't important too. Our logos can influence and change us, but it never replaces the mythos that we're steeped in. I heard a quote about this once. I've never been able to find the source, but the quote was that while a fact may be the smallest unit of information, a story is the smallest unit of meaning. Facts don't make meaning. Story makes meaning. So Lichtig concludes after telling that story about him and Ming, superheroes are the perfect representation of secular saints, gods of a new era. In our need to find a way to celebrate something in common, we turn to superheroes rather than taking us to Mount Olympus. Comic books place the heroes in a specifically postmodern context. It's a world where unified truth, trust in institutions, the will to fight against evil as we find it in our world are all futile. Superheroes offer us a way out. They offer us perspective. They help us hope in the power of one person to do good. They give us ways to reimagine ourselves. They show us a way toward the happy ending, and they let us have fun doing it. So given that role of superheroes, I find it especially exciting the way that our superhero myths have changed and transformed over the last several decades. From a Superman who did it all on his own, tough and masculine and always at the center, to Captain Planet, or to the Justice League, a pantheon of heroes who work together, the diverse, interdependent team saving the world one collaboration at a time. And other retellings of old mythology have changed too, of course. That Atlas, we are all Atlas, Shane says. Or the British author Neil Gaiman's book, American Gods, was an acclaimed novel where the premise was a clash between the old gods who had lost their power in North America as people stopped worshiping them. A clash between them and the new gods of the digital age. At one point in the story, Odin, one of the old gods, of course, is giving a pep talk to the other old gods. Need a little encouragement to continue on this fight. And he says to them, there are new gods growing in America, clinging to growing knots of belief, new gods of credit card and freeway, of internet and telephone, of radio and hospital and television, gods of plastic and of beeper and of neon. Proud gods, fat and foolish creatures, puffed up with their own newness and importance. When I first read Gaiman's book a number of years ago, it seemed like the whole premise must have stemmed from this quote of our heretical Unitarian ancestor I mentioned earlier, the transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson said this, you might have heard it, it's one of those readings in the back of our hymnal. It's that a person will worship something. A person will worship something, have no doubt about that. We may think our tribute is paid in secret in the dark recesses of our heart, but it will out. It will out. That which dominates our imaginations and our thoughts will determine our lives and character. Therefore, it behooves us to be careful what we worship. For what we are worshiping, we are becoming. What superpower do you want? Who are your gods? What are you worshiping? Do you have a pantheon? Who are your saints? Your gods, your superheroes that dance in your imagination. Because if we're not careful, we may end up worshiping gods we'd really rather not. You pick your gods, or the world will pick them for you. The pantheon of my adult imagination, my adult theological imagination, it's not actually quite as centered on superheroes as I might be giving off, or old myths. It's reflected in an Episcopal chapel in San Francisco called St. Gregory of Nyssa. Like many chapels, the vaulted dome there is painted with icons of saints. But unlike most chapels, these saints are dancing. And they are some faces you would not expect. They range from traditional figures like King David and Teresa of Avila and Francis of Assisi to people also like Malcolm X, Anne Frank, Albert Einstein, Margaret Mead. The church says they represent musicians, artists, mathematicians, martyrs, scholars, mystics, lovers, prophets, and sinners from all times, from many faiths and many backgrounds, all holding hands and dancing with one another around the chapel. And my adult pantheon, it certainly includes scientific principles, like the four fundamental forces of the universe, the four fundamental interactions: gravitational, electromagnetic, strong nuclear, weak nuclear. Everybody's up on your physics, right? I wish someone would personify and superheroize the four fundamental forces. Not for a physics lesson exactly, not to understand them from a logos way, but to make them comprehensible to our mythos minds. Can't you imagine it? These forces all striding around in capes and tights with scientific formulas emblazoned on their chests, and the fundamental four. It may not be as catchy as the Fantastic Four, but... And my adult pantheon, it's still enriched by a song I sang many times as a child in my Unitarian church. It's a song called Bring Many Names. It's my favorite hymn. We'll sing it to close today. I won't try and get you to sing it as often as I sang it growing up because it's got a lot of those G words in it. But I hope even if you don't care for God talk, the images will mean something as metaphors, as stories. If that word just gets under your skin, perhaps think of them as superheroes instead. The cadence won't quite work if you try and replace it as we sing, but you can know it in your heart. So, I suppose this is the invitation I'm making, to embrace a bit more mythos in your life. I promise your thorough training in Logos is going nowhere. So mythologize your life, superheroize your life. Maybe your family needs a good tagline. I can't say I recommend Fundamental Four, and Fantastic Four is already taken, but there are plenty of other alliterative number combinations available. Maybe it's your dynamic duo that needs a little mythic boost. When did you and a spouse, a partner, a lover last find yourselves the center of an epic romance? You might find it too silly to bump your rings together and declare Wonder Twins activate, or by our powers combined, but I bet there are other rituals at your fingertips or deep in your stories that could summon the mythic powers at play in your journey. Maybe you need a red cape in a drawer at your office to pull out in case of emergency. Our mythologies in our world could sure use more superhero grandmas and grandpas. So maybe all the question is what I asked our kids earlier. What superpower do you already have? How will you use it to save the world? Thank you, and amen.